The year was 1898, and while the rest of the world was looking toward the dawn of a new century filled with steel and electricity, Charles Franklin Kettering was trapped in a nightmare of darkness. Born into the relentless rhythm of a Loudonville farm, Charlie was a boy whose mind outpaced the slow rotation of the seasons. While his brothers accepted the plow and the calloused hands of their father as their ultimate fate, Charlie spent his nights staring at the mechanical guts of broken farm equipment under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. He wasn't just fixing tools. He was deciphering a language of gears and levers that no one else on the farm could hear. But every time he reached for the knowledge he craved, his own body revolted. As he struggled through his early teaching years to fund an engineering degree at the College of Worcester, a mysterious and agonizing eye strain struck. The very act of reading a textbook became a descent into physical torture. His vision blurred into a gray haze, and splitting headaches left him incapacitated in darkened rooms. To the community, it looked like a sign from God. The farmer's son was being pulled back to the earth, punished for his ambition to leave the soil for the laboratory. The tragedy of Kettering's youth wasn't just the pain, but the repeated crushing of his hope. Twice he gathered his meager savings to enroll at Ohio State University, and twice he was forced to flee back to the countryside, defeated by a blindness that doctors couldn't explain. He found himself stringing telephone lines across the Ohio wilderness, a man with the soul of an inventor working as a common laborer, watching his peers graduate and build the future he had envisioned for himself. He lived in a world of shadows, teaching children their ABCs while his own engineering manuals sat mocking him on the shelf. Yet beneath this layers of failure, Kettering was developing a trait more lethal than genius, an absolute refusal to accept the logic of defeat. He trained his mind to visualize complex electrical circuits without the need for paper, building blueprints in the darkness of his mind. The unexpected turn came during his third and final attempt at university. Despite his eyes still screaming for mercy, Kettering realized that his struggle had gifted him a unique perspective. He didn't see machines with his eyes anymore. He understood them through the flow of energy. He finally graduated at the late age of 28, but the man who emerged from the shadows wasn't just an engineer. He was a survivor who had learned that the most powerful mechanisms are the ones built in total darkness, a realization that would soon lead him to a company that demanded he do the impossible every single day. In 1904, Charles Kettering arrived at the National Cash Register Company, NCR, in Dayton, Ohio, carrying a diploma that had nearly cost him his sight and a job title that sounded like a dare: electrical inventor. The company, led by the iron-fisted John H. Patterson, was a juggernaut of mechanical precision, but its products were trapped in the past. Every transaction required a clerk to turn a heavy, sluggish hand crank, a physical labor that was slow, prone to error, and exhausting. Kettering, still carrying the grit of the telephone line crews, looked at the brass-bound mechanical monsters and saw an archaic relic. While the senior engineers lived in ivory towers of theory, Kettering did something scandalous for the time. He abandoned his desk to live with the sales gang. He stood behind counters, watching frustrated clerks and impatient customers, realizing that the English disease of bureaucracy was killing the retail industry. He envisioned a cash register powered by a tiny, high-torque electric motor, a concept that the world's leading experts dismissed as a fire hazard. They argued that a motor small enough to fit inside a register would burn out instantly under the load. Kettering ignored them, drawing on his ability to visualize energy flow in the dark, and developed a motor that didn't run constantly but delivered a violent, precise burst of power only when needed.
Kettering's rebellion against traditional engineering reached its zenith with the invention of the OK credit phone. In 1906, retail credit was a logistical nightmare. A customer wanting to buy on time meant a clerk had to physically run to a central office, wait for a manager to manually check paper ledgers, and run back, a process that bled 15 minutes of profit. Kettering bypassed the shoe leather entirely. He designed a system that linked sales counters to the central office via a solenoid-operated stamping machine. With a single telephonic signal, the manager could verify credit and remotely stamp the approval at the register. What once took a quarter of an hour now took 15 seconds. This was the birth of automated retail, a digital ghost born in a world of brass and paper. But the unexpected twist came not from the machine, but from the men who used it. By creating a motor that could survive burst usage, Kettering had unknowingly solved the greatest engineering riddle of the 20th century. He had perfected the high-torque, intermittent-use motor, the exact technology needed to replace the deadly hand crank on the front of every automobile in the world. He was no longer just fixing cash registers, he had accidentally built the heart of the modern car. And the world was about to find out how many lives that heart could save.
By 1910, the automobile was a miracle of speed, but it carried a dark, primitive secret. It was a machine that could maim its master. Every journey began with a lethal gamble at the front of the vehicle, where a heavy iron crank had to be rotated by hand to fire the engine. If the timing was off, a frequent occurrence in those early days, the engine would kick back, spinning the metal handle with the force of a sledgehammer. Broken arms were so common they were nicknamed chauffeur's fracture, but for Byron Carter, a close friend of Cadillac founder Henry Leland, the price was even higher. Carter stopped to help a stranded motorist on the Belle Isle Bridge in Detroit. The crank kicked back, shattered his jaw, and the resulting infection killed him. This tragedy sent a shockwave through the industry, and a grieving Leland turned to the only man who had mastered burst power at NCR, Charles Kettering. Working in the humid, oil-stained shadows of Edward Deed's barn in Dayton, Kettering and his barn gang began a desperate race against the skeptics. While elite university engineers insisted that a motor powerful enough to turn a frozen engine would require batteries the size of a piano, Kettering knew better. He gambled everything on the impossible idea that a tiny motor could produce massive torque for a few seconds without burning out, just like his cash registers. The birth of Delco, Dayton Engineering Laboratories Company, was not a corporate triumph, but a gritty, all-night struggle in a hayloft. Kettering, now 33 and risking his family's financial security, unloaded a prototype of his integrated electrical system into a test car. It wasn't just a starter, it was a total reimagining of the car's nervous system, combining starting, lighting, and ignition into one rechargeable loop. The engineering world held its breath in 1911 when Cadillac agreed to test the device. The impossible machine worked with a surgical click, replacing the violent struggle of the hand crank with the simple turn of a key. The impact was instantaneous and revolutionary. It didn't just save lives, it socialized the automobile. For the first time, elderly drivers and women could operate a car without a team of strong-armed men to assist them. However, the unexpected twist came not from the technology, but from the shadow of the coming war. By eliminating the hand crank, Kettering had inadvertently created the first automated cockpit. He had proven that human labor could be replaced by a pre-programmed electrical impulse, a realization that, as the world moved toward 1917, would lead the military to ask Kettering to do the one thing no one had ever dared: remove the driver entirely and turn the machine itself into a weapon. By 1917, the horizon of the Great War had shifted from the mud of the trenches to the vast, terrifying expanse of the sky.
The U.S. Army Aircraft Board, desperate to break the bloody stalemate in Europe without sacrifice of more American lives, turned to Charles Kettering with a request that bordered on science fiction: build a flying bomb that could navigate itself. Kettering, the man who had already conquered the darkness of his own blindness and the lethality of the hand crank, saw this not as a weapon but as a problem of pure automation. He assembled an unprecedented all-star team of innovators, including Orville Wright, the pioneer of flight, and Elmer Sperry, the master of gyroscopes. Together, they birthed the Kettering aerial torpedo, affectionately and later terrifyingly nicknamed the Bug. It was a bizarre, minimalist biplane crafted from papier-mâché, cardboard, and wood laminates, designed to be mass-produced for a mere $400. In an era where aviation was still a fragile art of wire and canvas, Kettering was attempting to build a disposable Predator, the world's first cruise missile. The true genius of the Bug lay not in its cheap airframe, but in the invisible mechanical brain Kettering installed within it. Drawing on his experience with the automated systems of NCR cash registers and Delco starters, he developed a guidance system that utilized an aneroid barometer for altitude and a series of mechanical cams to count engine revolutions. The plan was chillingly precise. Once the engine reached a predetermined number of rotations, the wings would simply detach and the explosive-laden fuselage would plunge into its target like a lightning bolt. Kettering sat in his Dayton laboratories surrounded by blueprints that anticipated modern warfare by nearly 80 years. He wasn't just building a plane, he was building an algorithm. However, the unexpected twist came during the final preparations for the secret trials. As the team adjusted the delicate barometers, they realized the Bug possessed a terrifying sensitivity to the environment that no human pilot could mimic. It was a machine that felt the air pressure, making it the first weapon in history capable of making its own binary decisions in flight. The Bug was no longer just a tool of war, it was the dawn of autonomous destruction. And the upcoming test in Dayton was about to prove just how uncontrollable that power could be.
October 2, 1918, marked the day when Charles Kettering's cardboard Predator was finally supposed to prove its worth to the high command of the U.S. military. On a secluded airfield in Dayton, Ohio, a group of stern, high-ranking generals and government officials gathered, their eyes fixed on the Bug as it sat perched on its launching dolly. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of oil and the heavy weight of expectation. Millions of dollars and the hope of ending the war without further American blood rested on this papier-mâché biplane. Kettering, calm but intensely focused, gave the signal. The engine roared to life, and the Bug hurtled down the portable track, lifting into the air with surprising grace. For a few heart-pounding seconds, it seemed as though the impossible had been achieved. But then, the algorithm failed. Instead of leveling out toward the horizon, the Bug's nose pitched upward in a violent, erratic arc. It stalled for a terrifying heartbeat, then flipped and plummeted back toward the earth, disintegrating into a heap of cardboard and wood. The silence that followed was only broken by the settling dust, but the true chaos was only beginning. The failure of the first flight was just the prelude to a series of tests that turned from a scientific demonstration into a scene of pure military absurdity. During subsequent attempts, the Bug's guidance system, the very mechanical brain Kettering had so carefully crafted, began to act as if it were possessed. Instead of flying towards its target, one prototype veered sharply toward the observation stand, forcing the decorated generals to abandon their dignity and dive for cover in the dirt. Imagine the scene, the most powerful men in the U.S. Army scattering like frightened schoolboys, while an unmanned, explosive-capable aircraft careened wildly overhead. General Hap Arnold later recounted the terror of being hunted by Kettering's creation across the field. Yet, the unexpected twist came when the military, despite the chaotic spectacle, didn't cancel the project.
While they mocked the bug's unpredictability, they were secretly terrified by its potential. They realized that if the bug was this dangerous to its creators, it would be a nightmare for the enemy. However, before a single bug could be deployed to the trenches of France, the armistice was signed. The project was abruptly halted, and in a move that baffled Kettering, the government issued a total gag order, burying the bug in the deepest vaults of military secrecy for the next 20 years, as if the Ogre of Dayton had never existed.
The signing of the armistice in 1918 brought a deafening silence to the Dayton workshops. While the American public celebrated the end of the war to end all wars, Charles Kettering found himself bound by a military gag order that would last nearly 30 years. The Bug, the world's first cruise missile, was scrubbed from the history books, its cardboard wings and gyroscopic brains locked away in classified vaults as if they were a dangerous secret the world wasn't yet ready to handle. Kettering, however, was not a man to dwell on ghosts. In 1920, he transitioned from the Ogre of Dayton to a titan of industry, becoming the vice president and director of research for General Motors. This era transformed him into a household name, the American Wizard of Innovation. He spent his days in a lab coat rather than a flight suit, directing the development of technologies that would define the 20th century. Four-wheel brakes, safety glass, and the high-speed two-stroke diesel engine. He was the man who made the modern world comfortable, but beneath the veneer of corporate success, the lessons of the Bug, the science of automated precision, remained the invisible foundation of everything he built. By the mid-1930s, Kettering was at the pinnacle of his fame, appearing on the cover of Time magazine and celebrated as the heir to Thomas Edison. He worked alongside chemist Thomas Midgley Jr. to solve the engine knock problem with leaded gasoline and developed Freon for refrigeration, inventions that brought him immense wealth and global influence. Yet the great silence regarding his wartime work created a strange duality in his life. When reporters asked about his contributions to World War I, he spoke of ignition systems and synthetic fuels, never breathing a word about the autonomous predator that had once chased generals across a field in Ohio. The unexpected twist came as the 1930s drew to a close and the shadows of a new, even darker conflict began to stretch across Europe. In Washington, military planners were quietly pulling dusty files from the archives, rereading the reports of the 1918 trials. They realized that while Kettering had been busy perfecting the civilian automobile, the world had finally caught up to his impossible vision. The secret weapon wasn't dead, it was merely waiting for the right moment to be reborn, and the man who had been silenced was about to be called back to the center of the storm.
By 1940, the Great Silence was shattered by the roar of a second global conflict, one that Charles Kettering had long anticipated. As President Franklin Roosevelt established the National Inventors Council to mobilize America's brightest minds, he chose Kettering to lead it, bringing the Ogre of Dayton back into the inner sanctum of military strategy. The world was now a place of radar, high-speed radio, and advanced rocketry, the very ecosystem that had been missing in 1918. In London, the terrifying buzz of German V-1 flying bombs began to fill the skies. These vengeance weapons were hauntingly familiar. They were the mechanical descendants of Kettering's Bug, utilizing the same principles of catapult launches, gyroscopic stabilization, and engine revolution counting to strike targets from a distance. The irony was not lost on the American High Command. The weapon they had ridiculed and buried 20 years earlier as a cardboard toy had become the primary instrument of Nazi terror. Kettering, now in his mid-60s, watched as his impossible prophecy was fulfilled by the enemy, proving that being right too early is often the most frustrating form of genius. The sudden declassification of the Bug's files within military circles triggered a frantic industrial resurrection. American engineers, now armed with the electronic advances of the 1940s, realized that the Bug's original blueprints were the blueprint for the future of the Allied counteroffensive. Under Kettering's guidance, the concept evolved into the Interstate TDR-1, an assault drone that combined the Bug's autonomous flight with a new revolutionary feature: a television camera in the nose and radio control guidance. While the original Bug was a blind predator, its successor could see its prey. The shocking twist came when the U.S. Navy successfully deployed these drones in the Pacific Theater, using them to strike Japanese merchant ships and hardened bunkers without risking a single pilot. The Bug had finally graduated from a secret embarrassment into a decisive strategic edge. As Kettering stood in a secure briefing room, watching flickering black and white footage of a drone striking its target with surgical precision, he realized that the age of the warrior had transitioned into the age of the operator. The cardboard wings of 1918 had finally turned into the wings of modern global dominance, and the man who was once laughed at by generals was now the architect of their victory.
In 1945, as the smoke cleared from the ruins of a global conflict, the secret that Charles Kettering had guarded for nearly 3 decades was finally laid bare. The U.S. military declassified the Bug project, revealing to a stunned public that the age of the cruise missile hadn't begun in a Nazi laboratory, but in a dusty hayloft in Dayton, Ohio, back in 1918. Kettering, now an elder statesman of science with 186 patents to his name, stood before the press not as a merchant of death, but as a man who had finally been vindicated by time. He had outlived the skeptics, the generals who had hidden in trenches to escape his prototypes, and the experts who had called his electrical systems a fire hazard. The Bug was no longer a secret embarrassment, it was a museum piece, recognized as the biological ancestor of the jet engines and autonomous drones that were now defining the Cold War. Kettering had learned the most bitter and profound lesson of innovation. Being right too early is indistinguishable from being wrong until the world catches up. The true twist of Kettering's legacy lies in the definition of failure. While the Bug never saw combat in its original form, the failures of 1918 were the essential data points that allowed the TDR-1 drones and eventually the Tomahawk cruise missiles to succeed. Kettering passed away in 1958, but his spirit remains embedded in every automated system that governs our modern lives, from the GPS in our pockets to the self-starting engines of our cars. He proved that the most dangerous thing in the world is not a weapon, but a persistent mind that refuses to accept the limitations of its era. As modern drones circle battlefields today, they carry the invisible DNA of a cardboard biplane built by a man who couldn't see his own textbooks. Charles Kettering didn't just invent machines, he invented the future, proving that a farmer's son of Ohio could reach out from the darkness of a workshop and touch the stars, leaving a world that was faster, safer, and infinitely more automated than the one he found.